She walked through the bustling terminal, suitcase wheels rattling lightly on the tiled floor as announcements echoed overhead. To anyone watching, she was simply another passenger among the hundreds streaming through the gates that morning. Her eyes were fixed on the boarding pass in her hand, carefully checking the gate number, the zone, the time. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the nearby cafe, mingling with the sharp tang of jet fuel seeping in every time the automatic doors opened. Her mind wasn't on anything extraordinary. She was thinking of her seat assignment, whether she would get overhead space for her bag, and if she should have grabbed a snack before boarding. It was just another ordinary day, just another journey from one place to another. The line moved slowly, people adjusting carry-ons, parents corralling restless children, business travelers tapping on phones, earbuds pressed in tight. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, glanced at the big glass window where planes sat waiting, tails pointed like arrows toward the sky. There was nothing to suggest that this particular flight would be any different from the countless ones she had taken before. The rhythm was familiar, boarding groups being called, passports being checked, a soft shuffle of shoes moving forward step by step. She felt the usual mixture of restlessness and anticipation. Her thoughts wandered to the seatbelt clicking shut, the soft hum of the engines, and the chance to finally relax once she settled into her seat. The gate attendant smiled mechanically as each boarding pass beeped and passengers filed down the jet bridge. A tired man in front of her adjusted his backpack. A teenager scrolled through his phone, and she glanced at the screen to see the bright reflection of a game. Everything about it felt predictable, the kind of predictability that makes airports both comforting and monotonous. She clutched her bag a little tighter and let her gaze wander across the crowd, noting the different faces, different lives, all merging into a single line for a single destination. Her pace slowed as the line bottlenecked near the scanner. She took a small breath, almost unconsciously preparing herself for the cramped cabin, the recycled air, the hours in the sky. There was no sign of anything unusual. Her thoughts remained fixed on the normal, everyday details of flying. Should she have taken the aisle seat? Would she have enough time at her layover? Did she remember to switch her phone to airplane mode before boarding? She tapped the edge of her boarding pass against her palm in rhythm with her thoughts. The chatter around her was low and steady, punctuated by the occasional laugh or a baby's cry. The clinking of a rolling suitcase, zipper being forced closed, echoed faintly behind her. She glanced at her watch, then at the jet bridge, then back to the attendant who scanned another passenger's ticket with practiced efficiency. Each small moment seemed to flow into the next, a seamless continuation of what always happens at airports. Nothing stood out, nothing caught her attention beyond the ordinary. She adjusted her scarf, shifted her bag from one shoulder to the other, and let her gaze drift lazily toward the floor. Her feet were tired from walking across terminals, from standing in lines, from the endless rhythm of travel. She could already imagine the relief of sitting down, of slipping off her shoes just slightly, of letting the hours pass quietly above the clouds. There was comfort in the thought that soon she would be in the sky, tucked into a routine she had experienced many times before. The crowd pressed forward again, and she followed without question, a part of the flow, a part of the ordinary rhythm of departure. The sound of a boarding pass being scanned broke through her thoughts, followed by the shuffle of the line inching forward once more. Her hand tightened around her bag handle as she prepared to take her turn. The faint murmur of voices carried through the air, the scent of coffee still lingering, and the mechanical voice overhead announced another final call for a distant gate. Everything blended into the familiar background of travel, so ordinary that it hardly needed noticing. She was just another traveler in the stream of passengers, just another person stepping toward the plane, her thoughts simple, her expectations routine, her focus narrowed on the journey ahead. The line had started to move with a little more speed, the boarding gate buzzing steadily as more passengers filed through. She stepped closer, boarding pass in her hand, almost ready to cross the threshold from terminal to jet bridge. There was a rhythm to the way everyone moved, a practiced choreography of shuffling forward, tugging bags, adjusting coats. The ordinary scene hummed with the usual airport energy. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, something broke through that rhythm. It began with a faint thud, a sound that didn't belong in the pattern of rolling suitcases and boarding calls. She turned her head instinctively, and before her eyes could fully process what was happening, a body crumpled to the floor. The man had been walking just ahead of her, his frame broad and upright only seconds before. Now he lay collapsed at her feet, his hand stretching instinctively toward the ground to catch himself, but failing to find balance. The sound of his fall startled those nearby, their chatter cutting off mid-sentence, replaced by gasps sharp enough to pierce the air. Her eyes darted downward, locking onto the figure sprawled across the gate's hard floor. He was dressed simply, nothing that screamed for attention. Loose shirt, worn jeans, boots that had clearly seen rougher places than this polished terminal. But what stood out wasn't his clothing. It was the weight that seemed to pull him down, as if gravity had claimed him with more force than it did anyone else. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his breath shallow, his face tight with strain. For a moment, the world around her blurred. The movement of other passengers halted, the line froze, and she felt suspended in that single instant where ordinary had cracked into something she did not yet understand. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. She took a step back, almost stumbling as the corner of her bag brushed against her leg. A murmur rippled through the waiting line, the kind of sound that grows when people aren't sure whether to intervene or stand still. The gate agent's hand paused mid-air, scanning device hovering, her face shifting from routine professionalism to sudden alarm. A child clutched at his mother's sleeve, eyes wide, while a businessman muttered something under his breath, edging sideways to give the fallen man space. The man's arm shifted weakly, as though he wanted to push himself up, but his strength faltered. His hand slipped against the smooth floor and landed flat, fingers splayed, knuckles trembling from the effort. His body was strong. There was no denying the muscle built into his frame, but whatever force was pulling him down was stronger. He gasped once, his breath ragged, and it hit her that this wasn't just faintness or fatigue. This was something deeper, something that had been carried long before he reached this boarding line. Someone whispered the word medical. Another voice called out for help, but no one moved immediately. Passengers were caught between instinct and hesitation, that fragile pause when ordinary people confront the unexpected. She stared down at him, her heartbeat quickening, not fully aware that her hand had clenched around her boarding pass so tightly that the paper crinkled in her grip. The details of him sharpened in her vision. His jawline was unshaven, stubble rough against pale skin. There was a scar visible just above his collarbone, faint but jagged, the kind of mark that carried a story. His boots were scuffed in ways that airports couldn't explain. And even in his fallen state, there was something about him that carried weight beyond the scene at her feet. The crowd sensed it too, though they couldn't yet name what it was. This wasn't simply a man who had tripped or grown dizzy from lack of sleep. There was history etched into him, a silent heaviness that had finally forced its way into the open. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she glanced at the others frozen around her. Time stretched uncomfortably. The hum of the airport still existed. Announcements, luggage wheels, the distant roar of an engine outside. But it all seemed muted against the raw presence of the man lying on the floor. He tried to shift again, his lips parting as though he might speak, but no words came. Only the weight of his body pressing harder into the ground at her feet, leaving her with the undeniable sense that the simple act of boarding the plane had been interrupted by something far greater than she could have imagined. Around him the air seemed to thicken, as though the weight pressing down on his chest extended outward into the space itself. People could see a strong man on the floor, someone whose physical presence spoke of discipline and training, yet what kept him pinned was not just exhaustion. It was something deeper, less visible, a battle he had been carrying within himself long before his body gave way. The crowd whispered, shifting uneasily, unable to name what they were witnessing but sensing it was more than an ordinary collapse. He looked like a soldier, not just in the scars that mapped his skin but in the way his posture, even while fallen, still carried a kind of readiness. Yet there was no denying the fragility in his breaths, the quiet tremors that shook through him. The invisible battles rarely announce themselves until a moment like this. They hide behind steady gazes, strong shoulders, firm handshakes, and practiced silence. No one could have guessed, as he walked through the terminal minutes earlier, that he was carrying wounds heavier than any bag slung over his shoulder. His struggle wasn't the kind that could be stitched or bandaged in an airport medical room. It wasn't even the kind most people recognized, because there were no obvious markers, no red warning signs. But in the way his body yielded to the ground, in the way his breath came uneven and strained, it was clear that whatever lived inside him had been building for a long time. The passengers around him stood caught in that realization without knowing how to voice it. Their instinct told them this was more than faintness, more than physical fatigue. His collapse was layered, like the final crack in something that had been under pressure for too long. She stared at him, her mind racing to understand, noticing things others might have overlooked. The way his hands twitched as though remembering an action, the subtle marks along his forearms that hinted at past injuries, the haunted flicker in his eyes that stayed even while closed. These were not random details. They were fragments of a story no one could see fully, but one that was etched into him like shadow. Every breath he took seemed to fight against something unseen. There was no visible wound, no blood pooling beneath him, no dramatic scene of violence. Yet the tension in his body spoke louder than any open injury. This was the kind of pain that doesn't declare itself to strangers, the kind that can be carried in silence until it decides to erupt. A pain that belongs to people who have walked into battles and returned from them, outwardly whole, but inwardly marked. She had never seen it this close before. It made her heart pound with a mix of fear and awe, recognizing that the man collapsed in front of her was not falling from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of surviving too much. Someone knelt nearby, speaking softly, but the man didn't respond. His focus seemed turned inward, as though his body was in one place, but his mind was trapped elsewhere. His chest lifted unevenly, his eyes flickered behind closed lids, and it was almost as if he was reliving something beyond the airport floor. Those watching could feel it too, that haunting distance that separated him from them. He was lying there physically, but somewhere else entirely in spirit. It was a presence and an absence at the same time, a reminder that battles do not always end when the noise of war stops. The murmurs around her grew, voices shifting from confusion to hushed recognition. A few people whispered words like veteran or soldier, piecing together the clues from his appearance, the shape of his body, the strength still visible even in collapse. His boots, worn and battered, told their own quiet story. They had not been bought for fashion or casual travel. They had been lived in, tested in ways that most of the passengers at the gate would never fully comprehend. She noticed how even as he struggled to breathe evenly, his hand clenched into a fist, as though holding on to something unseen, refusing to let it slip entirely away. The atmosphere shifted. What had been a busy boarding line moments earlier now felt like a fragile pause in time, everyone hovering at the edges of understanding. They were witnessing not just a man's collapse, but the surfacing of the invisible weight he carried. For years, perhaps, it had remained hidden beneath strength and silence, but now it lay open in the most public of places, at the feet of strangers who had no idea what kind of battles lived inside him. She could feel it pressing into her as well, the undeniable truth that what brought him down was not the kind of wound that could be seen with the eyes, but the kind that leaves its mark deep, permanent, and invisible. In the split second after he collapsed, the air was filled with hesitation. People stood frozen, eyes darting toward one another, unsure of what to do next. The line that had been so orderly moments before had dissolved into a circle of unease. It was the kind of moment where time feels stretched, where everyone waits for someone else to act. Her breath quickened as she stared down at him, her instincts louder than her thoughts. Something inside her moved before she could rationalize it, pushing her body closer to his, dropping to her knees without considering who was watching. Her bag slid off her shoulder as she leaned toward him, hands trembling slightly but steadying themselves as they hovered near his chest. She didn't know if he could hear her, but her voice came anyway, soft at first, calling to him like someone waking a sleeper from a bad dream. The crowd watched, their silence heavy, but her attention was locked on the man at her feet. She saw the twitch of his jaw, the faint struggle in his breath, and every instinct she had told her to stay there, to let him feel the presence of another human being in that moment. It wasn't training or expertise that guided her. It was something more primal. The human instinct to reach out, to respond with compassion when faced with another's pain, surged through her. Her hand moved to his shoulder, gentle but grounding, as though to remind him he wasn't alone. She could feel the tension in his muscles beneath her touch, the kind of rigidity that spoke of years spent carrying more than one person should. The realization sent a shiver through her, but it also fueled her determination not to step back. Others began to stir. A man in a business suit crouched a little lower, offering to call for medical assistance. A mother hushed her child while fumbling for her phone. Yet it was her, on the floor beside him, who stayed closest, who let her body's instinct overrule the fear of doing something wrong. She didn't think about her flight anymore, or her seat assignment, or the quiet routine she had been expecting. In that moment, all that mattered was the man in front of her and the unspoken responsibility to respond to his collapse not with distance, but with care. His eyelids fluttered open for the briefest second, his gaze unfocused, but meeting hers nonetheless. The look in his eyes carried layers she couldn't name, a mixture of exhaustion, resistance, and the faintest flicker of recognition that someone had reached for him. It was enough to remind her why she had moved forward, why instinct had overridden hesitation. Compassion wasn't always about knowing what to do. It was about being willing to stay when someone else had fallen. She spoke again, words tumbling out without planning, small reassurances meant to anchor him to the present. Her tone was steady though her heart pounded in her chest. The sound of her voice seemed to soften the edge of the moment, drawing the focus of the circle inward, reminding everyone watching that this wasn't just a spectacle, it was a human being in need. Compassion had a way of breaking through paralysis, and slowly the others responded too, offering water, stepping forward to help with calls, kneeling a little closer to the ground. Still, she remained at his side, hand on his arm, breathing with him as though her steadiness might lend him some of her strength. She didn't care that strangers were staring, or that the floor of the airport was cold and unyielding. What mattered was the connection in that fragile instant, the silent promise that even when the weight of unseen battles dragged him down, there would be someone there willing to lean closer, not turn away. Every detail around her seemed sharper now, the hum of the terminal, the distant announcement of another flight, the murmurs of concerned voices, but they all faded in significance compared to the thrum of compassion that anchored her in place. The instinct to respond had pulled her out of the crowd, but it was compassion that kept her there, refusing to let go of the responsibility to stand witness to his struggle. She knew, without needing to explain it, that sometimes the greatest thing one can offer is presence, the quiet refusal to let another human being face their collapse in isolation. The scene at the gate no longer resembled the orderly process of boarding a plane. It had shifted into something heavier, something that carried meaning beyond travel schedules and seat numbers. For her, kneeling beside him, the moment began to stretch in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was as though life had pressed pause, giving her the chance to see not just a man on the floor, but the story that had brought him there. She had stepped into what felt like a crossing point, where two lives collided without warning. It wasn't something she could have planned for, but the weight of it was undeniable. This chance encounter was reshaping how she saw herself and how she saw the world. She thought about the ordinariness of her morning, how she had moved through the terminal with nothing on her mind but her own journey. A seat assignment, a boarding pass, a bag tucked carefully by her side, that had been the center of her world just minutes earlier. Now, as her hand rested gently on the shoulder of a man whose breath struggled to steady itself, those details seemed almost laughably small. The contrast was stark, and it pressed on her like a sudden awakening. Life could shift in a blink. What mattered a moment ago could dissolve instantly when faced with another human being's fragility. The strangers around her seemed to sense the same shift. People who had been focused on emails, coffee cups, and connecting flights now leaned forward, their attention drawn towards something more profound. She noticed the change in their eyes, the way their posture softened, as if they too felt pulled into the depth of what was happening. Compassion had cracked the surface, and through that crack came perspective. This wasn't just about helping someone in distress. It was about realizing that the stories carried by strangers are always larger than they appear on the surface. She thought of the man's boots, scuffed and worn in a way that suggested deserts or forests or training grounds far from this airport. She thought of the scars, faint but visible, and the way his body carried itself even in collapse, disciplined, trained, resilient despite its surrender. These weren't random details. They were glimpses into a life lived in extremes, a life that most of the people watching could hardly imagine. It struck her that while she had walked through the airport unseen, blending into the crowd, he had walked through carrying the invisible echoes of battle. And yet here they were, sharing the same floor, the same air, the same fragile moment. The encounter reshaped her understanding of presence. She realized how easy it was to move through life assuming that everyone else's story was simple, that the people brushing past in crowds were defined only by what was visible. But now she saw it differently. Each stranger was a book half closed, a narrative written in scars, memories, and battles unseen. This man's sudden collapse had forced open a page, and though she could not read the whole story, she had been given a glimpse deep enough to shift her perspective. She felt her own breath sinking unconsciously with his, steadying in rhythm as though lending him calm through proximity. It made her think about how fragile the boundary was between strength and vulnerability, how someone trained to survive the most brutal of conditions could still be brought down in the middle of an airport terminal. It was humbling, almost disorienting, to recognize that fragility doesn't discriminate. It comes for all people, soldiers, travelers, parents, strangers in line at a boarding gate. And in that realization, she found herself reevaluating her own assumptions about resilience and weakness. The way people reacted also struck her. Some had stepped back, creating distance as though fear of the unknown held them back. Others leaned forward, offering what little they could, their gestures small but meaningful. It reminded her that perspective isn't only shaped by the struggles we see, but by the choices we make when confronted with them. She was beginning to understand that this moment wasn't simply about the fallen soldier. It was about everyone around him, about their capacity to recognize the humanity in front of them and let it alter how they move through their own lives. As she knelt there, her knees pressed to the cold airport floor, her mind replayed the ordinary thoughts she had been holding minutes earlier. They seemed almost distant now, as though belonging to someone else. What filled her instead was the awareness that sometimes life delivers moments we never asked for, but ones that force us to see differently. What began as a routine flight had turned into an unspoken lesson. That perspective shifts not when we plan for it, but when life places us face to face with another person's truth. The airport was still humming around them, the distant announcements continuing, the shuffle of passengers moving toward other gates. Yet in the circle formed around the man on the floor, everything felt suspended. She could sense it in the faces turned toward him, in the stillness of strangers who only moments ago were rushing to board. There was an unspoken recognition spreading through the group. Every person who passes us carries a story, and most of the time we never see it. The weight of that realization hung in the air, binding together people who otherwise would have remained anonymous to each other. She looked again at the man in front of her. The scars she had noticed, the boots worn by years of use, the trembling effort of his hands as he tried to hold himself up, they all spoke of a life shaped by struggle and survival. His collapse was visible, but his story was not. Whatever battles had carved themselves into his body and mind remained hidden, carried silently until his strength gave way. And in that moment, his story was forced into the open, not by words, but by the undeniable truth of his body surrendering in a public place. It struck her that this was true of everyone around her. The woman clutching her child's hand, who looked exhausted but determined, likely carried her own private burdens. The businessman who had stepped back with unease might have battles invisible behind his pressed suit. Even she, standing there in the middle of it all, knew there were parts of her life no one could see simply by looking at her. The difference with him was that the invisible had made itself visible, demanding attention, reminding everyone that stories are rarely simple or silent. The strangers who had gathered around were beginning to see it too. Their expressions softened, shifting from initial alarm to quiet empathy. Some whispered questions, others exchanged uncertain glances, but the common thread was the realization that this man was more than what they first assumed. He wasn't just a collapsed passenger delaying the line. He was someone whose life had carried him through places and experiences far beyond what most of them would ever know. And in that recognition, the atmosphere changed. Judgment was replaced with understanding, and impatience with patience. Her thoughts wandered to how often people move through life brushing past one another, barely pausing to consider the depth of the lives around them. Airports especially are filled with fleeting encounters, faces glimpsed for seconds, names never known, stories never guessed. And yet here, in the middle of such a transient space, life had revealed one of its truths. Strangers are never just strangers. Each one is layered with memories, scars, and histories that remain hidden unless moments like this pull them into view. She stayed close to him, watching his shallow breaths, speaking softly when she thought he might hear. Every word she offered was simple, yet it carried the weight of acknowledgement. She wasn't just telling him he wasn't alone. She was silently telling herself and everyone else that presence matters, that recognizing another's story, even without knowing the details, can shift how we see the world. Her compassion wasn't about solving his struggles. It was about affirming his humanity in a moment when it might have felt lost. Around them, the ripple of empathy continued. Someone crouched to offer water. Another asked if he had family they could contact, and a few others began clearing space to make room for help. Each action was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern of care, a quiet acknowledgement that his unseen story mattered. It didn't need to be fully understood in order to deserve compassion. That realization connected them in ways the boarding line never could have. She found herself thinking that this moment would stay with her long after the flight, long after the man was lifted from the floor and the line resumed its orderly rhythm. The reminder was carved into her. Every stranger carries a story, whether visible or invisible, whether shared or silent. And sometimes life interrupts our routines to force that truth into focus. It was there at her feet now, undeniable and raw, teaching her that the world is made of people carrying more than we can ever know, and that the least we can offer is to meet them with presence and compassion when their story rises to the surface.